cracking down on employers who employ people who are living in the country illegally is moving in the Senate. An expansion of the state's E-Verify law was part of a larger Department of Commerce bill that a Senate committee approved today. It would require companies to keep E-Verify records. If the Commerce Department finds the business is not complying with the law, it would have a 30-day grace period before fines could be imposed. This bill doesn't go as far as the bill the House passed last week. That one would require all private employers to use